Hello and welcome to our Next Games That Weren't video, where today we're going to be taking a look at the early beginnings of Jimmy White's Whirlwind Snooker by the late Archer Maclean, looking at a number of early prototypes and screens. The following that we're about to show has been recovered from the disc archive of Archer and is thanks to the kind loan by Chris Wilkins of Fusion Retro Books. For downloads and more, please check out the link in the video description. When preserving Archer's discs, we found a PC disc with files dated from 1989 containing a set of GWBasic files. Upon loading up and running, we were surprised to see very early 3D tests for what would eventually lead to Archer creating a 3D snooker table. These early tests that you can see right now are just demonstrating the very basic rotation options, just as a very simple proof of concept. However, it's this last basic prototype which is most interesting overall. This piece of code here has a partial and early implementation of an actual snooker table, using the same rotational code to actually show it in full action, and with some very basic rotation and zoom options. This gives us one of the very earliest demonstrations of Archer's concept. At this stage, the graphics are not filled in, and there are no pockets, but it's enough to kind of get the kind of wheels spinning in motion for the project overall. Our next prototype now switches over to the Atari ST, which seemed to be the lead development platform for Archer's new snooker game. The flickering that you can see is just a mock-up image and not of the actual game itself. For now, this particular prototype just features unfilled vectors. At this stage, it hasn't got any ties to Jimmy White and even mentions Steve Davis in the player list. The icons and the display is very early, as you can see, and you can't play any shots, but you can see a very familiar looking table like we saw in the previous basic demo, now moving a lot faster due to the implementation in assembly language. But as well as this, there are also some other familiar objects too, which we'll see in a moment, including some additional test objects. Here we just have a basic square. Then we have the familiar looking X, Y and Z coordinate test, like we saw in the basic demo. Then additionally, Archer implemented his own name using vectors and with the different colours. Here we're just using the built-in rotational effects that you could activate by pressing some of the keys. Then tucked away is a slightly more complex version of the table, now featuring a brown outer frame but also pockets as well. Then again, there are a couple more test objects, which might have been the beginning of something else. This may have been perhaps a cue. And then tucked further away are the words snooker written using vector objects. So not a sign of Jimmy White at any point at all. Also tucked away are a series of debug screens. The next prototype is much more advanced and features a solid field table that looks far more familiar to fans of the game. Here you can interact with the game using the mouse and do basic rotations and movements as you would do in the final game. However, trying to take a shot will crash things out completely. As with the first prototype, there are a number of different key presses that you can make to interact and test out the engine. One key activated this message, which shows that it was a prototype sent to Charles Cecil on the 18th of May 1990. Also, although you can't shoot, you can first of all press F4 to start the white ball, moving back and forth, and also another key to then rotate the table so you can see underneath it. So also tucked away in the prototype is a much more sophisticated debug system that Archer had built for himself, and this too can be activated by pressing one of the keys on the keyboard. So based on where the actual table is positioned at the time, it will go into this mode and allow you to kind of test each of the different key points of the table. And there is a number of different modes that you can kind of flick between, which allows you to kind of test different parts of the table, maybe collision points, but also, as we'll see in a moment, just the position of where the balls are. So there are also keys which will kind of zoom you straight through the table, which is quite interesting. And then there's also keys which will change the layout of the table. So here we can see just the standard snooker layout. And then changing again in a moment, we can get to like a sort of a trick shot layout, I guess, just with all the reds sort of lined up in a row. Another key will also make the balls completely float up in the air, so you can actually see them just floating there. But additionally, you can animate the ball again, just to kind of go back and forth against an imaginary boundary of the table. So like with the first prototype, you can also press keys in this one to change the objects and the actual table itself. So here we've made the table slightly thinner with a different variation. And then there's another variation on there that you can sort of spin around and look at, but with no actual snooker balls present. This may have been maybe a pool table or something similar. Then we have a set of like 3D cubes that you can spin and rotate, which was clearly done as some kind of a test for Archer to try out the engine and try different things. This is followed by a set of kind of strange objects, really, including something which will be very familiar if you grew up in the 80s and 90s in the UK. First of all, we have this strange object here, which might be something to do with a snooker cue or something similar, we're not sure. Then there's a strange sort of T shape that can be rotated. And then a flat area of green, which was possibly another kind of test for the snooker table. Then we have the familiar snooker text like we saw in the first prototype, but now in a more solid 3D approach. Just to note that there's no mention of Archer's name like there was in the first prototype, and you can clearly see there's still no mention of Jimmy White at this stage either. Then another strange object which we have no idea what it is, followed by a standard cube, and then one where the actual faces have been split out slightly. And then perhaps you may recognise this if you grew up in the UK during the 80s and 90s with a famous Channel 4 logo, which was quite a surprise to see. I'm not sure if this is actually hidden away or tucked into the release game itself, but I thought this was quite cool. The last prototype could actually be the most interesting of them all, but unfortunately we can't tell you when we can't check it out, and that's because of this elaborate code sequence that Archer's now put on top of it. Clearly, Archer must have known that he had something very special on his hands, so started to get very protective of his work. So unfortunately, we couldn't find any trace of what the number might be, So we've included the actual disc within the archive. If anyone's able to crack it and get in, please do let us know, as we'd love to be able to do another video to kind of showcase it. But yeah, it's kind of one of those things that I'm very curious now just to see what is behind these closed doors. Was there any kind of Jimmy White references at this stage? Was it playable? Hopefully very soon we'll get to find out. So to conclude, we're now going to take a look at a series of NeoPaint files which showcase in chronological order how Archer's vision for his snooker game would evolve over time, including a number of different interface icons, many which got dropped from the final game, and also how he kind of wanted the actual table to look and feel. So there's many bits and pieces here which never would have made the final cut, and various different design choices which also were dropped, but also many which were included in the end. There's also the familiar kind of faces on the balls, so when you kind of left things they would suddenly appear, and also some unfamiliar things which got dropped for whatever reason. There's the first reference to Jimmy White with Whirlwind, and also Virgin Games as well. And then the final set of icons, there was a couple of variations based on the European and US markets, so we could see the slightly different measurement bars there. And there's possibly other bits and pieces here which never made the final cut. One of the other things that was quite interesting were some bits and pieces not related to the game at all, including these Dropzone sprites, and also this missile command background. Then there were a series of different scans which Archer must have been doing with a scanner at the time, showcasing various scenes from different Disney films and cartoons, and also a still from a video. And that concludes our look at Archer Maclean's Snooker, before it was Jimmy White's Whirlwind Snooker. I hope you've enjoyed the video, but all of this would not have been possible without the help of and generosity of Chris Wilkins of Fusion Retro Books, who allowed us to kind of preserve all of Archer's discs and also to showcase some of his early works from them. If you want to look at some of these early works for yourself, then please check out the link within the description. There are also some PC prototypes tucked away in there too, and also an unused MIDI file variation of the title music, I think. But I hope you've enjoyed it overall, and we'll have a lot more for you coming up very soon. So if I don't speak to you before, wish you all Merry Christmas and a Happy New Year, and take care everyone.